Mr. Jay Dardenne is the Louisiana's Commissioner of Administration, and he is here. Hey, Mr. Jay, how are you today?
Robert Aaron, good morning. I'm doing great.
A few days ago,
let
Governor...
me say something before I take your question.
Knock yourself out.
I'm really tired of all the misinformation that's out there from people who just don't want this administration to succeed. It's time for elected officials to speak honestly, to put up or shut up, and put some reality behind all the political rhetoric we're hearing. I will challenge any member of the legislature or any organization that's appeared on your show, for that matter, to come back on your show, present a specific written proposal they'll agree to introduce as an amendment to the budget that'll cut $1 billion, just like the governor was constitutionally required to do in the executive budget before July 1 of 2018. That's when the cliff becomes real. That's when $1 billion of temporary taxes rolls off the books. And the legislature voted for those taxes 27 months ago, and they disappear. Poof, they're gone on July 1. So it's time to replace the money or show us the specific cuts.
Would you be talking about anybody in particular?
Anybody who's been on the show, anybody who's saying we ought to simply cut and not replace the revenue, because that's really the issue here, is replacing the money that the legislature voted for 20-some-odd months ago that is going to be gone.
But
so
we've had 2 years we've had 2 years. That temporary tax was put on the books 2 years ago. Why has no one done anything in 2 years,
I
Jay?
wish I could answer that.
I know
for you,
that's
Aaron.
frustrating you too.
We've had at least three sessions since then. One was the fiscal session last year that was specifically to permanently fix the problem based upon the task force report that the legislature created and made recommendations that are consistent with best practices and what Louisiana needs to do to create some stability in its tax system and to broaden the base. And those proposals have been out there. The governor has said repeatedly he will accept any of those proposals that the legislature wants to approve or will approve, and no one in the legislature has stood up, at least none of those who are in opposition to the governor have stood up and said, this is what we would support, this is what we won't support, and here's where we'll cut. I mean, this is where the rubber hits the road. Where specifically are you going to cut $1 billion out of what is about $3.4 billion in state general fund income that's not constitutionally dedicated? You can't do it responsibly. I'm telling you, you can't do it responsibly.
I had started to mention earlier in the week, Governor John Bel Edwards gave a rather blunt assessment of the economic state of Louisiana. I think that was on Monday. On Tuesday, we had Senator Greg Tarver on, and this is what he had to say about what the governor had to say.
We're facing cutting our TOPS, Medicare for the poor. We're about to close all the hospitals in Louisiana because we do not have the necessary money.
Is Mr. Gregg legit? Is it that bad?
Well, unfortunately, the budget that we had to present that we do not support and we don't want to see enacted has to do that. Almost 80% of the state general fund is in health care, higher education, and TOPS.
So pardon me, when Greg
I'm sorry, in K-12 education.
When Greg Tarver says hospitals, meaning public hospitals, when Greg Tarver says public hospitals will close, you're saying he's not exaggerating.
Well, I can't tell you they're going to close, but they're not going to get almost $600 million in LDH money. State general fund is having to be cut unless there's some alternative found. I don't remember the exact amount that goes to the public-private partner hospitals, but I can tell you when we start cutting them in multiple millions of dollars, which is what would have to happen, they're going to have to reduce their services. They're going to have to reduce their workforce because they're not going to be getting the state dollars that have been promised to them to take over for the now closed charity hospital system. So the reality is those hospitals who have been our partners and who we've just finished negotiating with again to reduce what we give them, and that's a responsibility I've had, and we have reduced what the state has guaranteed to pay them in each of the 2 years that I've been dealing with them. But under this budget, if we don't have $1 billion, we're not going to be able to pay them what we've agreed to pay them. That's the unfortunate reality because, as I say, the money in the state general fund goes to the MFP, constitutionally dedicated $3 billion or so to higher education and to health care across the board. It's not just the hospitals. It's the delivery of health care services to the poor across Louisiana that is going to be in jeopardy, not to mention some of the optional services that are provided to the disabled and the people who are dependent upon some level of assistance in this state. And these are not people who are just on the dole. These are working people who have family members who cannot be taken care of independently.
Jay Dardenne, Commissioner of Administration. Let me, nuts and bolts. General fund budget. Let's not even talk about the 28 or nearly $29 billion overall budget. Right. General fund budget. From $8.2 billion in 15-16, it went up to $8.9 billion in 16-17. Now it's gone down a smidge to $8.7 billion for what's fiscal year 17-18. When folks want to tell me that $28 billion budget, oh, it's federal money, our general fund budget has gone up too. And I don't understand and this is my overall question, when our population is declining, how are we still increasing our general fund budget? Can you help me with that?
The general fund is a function of what people are paying in income taxes and sales taxes and general contributions from Louisianians to state government. And if you look at a chart, and I have a PowerPoint that I presented to the committee, and you look at the state general fund, it has risen fairly slightly but very consistently throughout the Jindal years. And as well as in the 1 year that this governor has been governor, it has gone up a little bit. And it's reflective of the income that people are paying and the contributions they're making in accordance with the laws that the legislature has enacted. You have to have a system that is going to grow to some extent. The state, any government is not immune to some inherent growth that takes place. But the huge growth in the government is absolutely because of matching federal dollars that only come about if the state makes some type of contribution. And look, I spent 15 years in the legislature, and in my first term, I was fighting tax increases from Edwards the First, and I submitted a budget plan that made cuts and said, I don't want to vote for this revenue. Here are the cuts I think ought to be made. I wasn't particularly successful. We did ratchet down what the governor wanted to raise at the time, but the point is, I was saying here's specifically what we ought not do. This is the obligation I think that legislators have. This is what their job is to pass a balanced budget that specifically provides for the funding of government. If there are things that they don't think government ought to be doing, tell us what they are. We've not heard a word from those people who are saying we simply ought to cut as to where those cuts ought to be. And we've said repeatedly, tell us where you think this money is.
The governor wants to do away with the temporary sales tax, but in an email he sent to lawmakers, I'm sure you're privy to it, he wants to expand the tax base to include services and on his list was insurance, data processing, information services, cable and satellite, repairs to real property. Some of that is real ambiguous. I don't quite understand where he's going, but revenue neutral means take away the temporary sales tax but add taxes on these services.
Yeah,
accurate?
It's a swap. That's exactly right. I mean, the notion is get rid of the temporary taxes that were passed and let's do something that permanently changes the structure so that it's broader based. This was the recommendation of the task force. This is not something the governor made up. This is the recommendation of the task force that said this is a way to broaden the base and make it more fair. And the proposal mirrors exactly what is done in Texas, which has been taxing these services for some period of time. So there's a template there of which ones could be taxed or should be taxed, how to go about doing it, and how to make sure people understand who is going to be taxed and what they would have to pay. It's a broadening of the base, which is the concept behind what the task force says makes sense. And I think any economist will tell you a tax system that is broad-based and lower rates is a sensible one.
Jay,
we don't have that.
Let me ask you this, and this is maybe a moron question. You can tell me I'm a moron if you want. Why can't the governor tell every state department head, you're going to have to cut 10% out of your budget, whatever the percentage is. I'm sorry, but we have to do this. Yes, it might mean jobs. Yes, it might mean cars, truck, whatever. Why is that not an option?
Aaron, it's not a moron question at all. And it's been done. It's being done. This is what I do when I meet with the department in terms of saying to people, cut back. Now, let me go to your point about 10%. I mean, these budgets have been cut through the years because during the Jindal years, the mask, it's the Mardi Gras season, the mask of a balanced budget was created because they used $800 plus million of one-time money to balance the recurring needs of the state. So everybody thought we were rocking along with a balanced budget, when in reality we're using money that disappeared after 1 year to fund recurring needs. That's disingenuous. It's not being honest with the people of the state. We've come in and said we're not going to do that anymore. That's irresponsible, and we're going to spend only recurring money on recurring needs, and that's what we've done. There have been cuts in these departments. There are continuing to be cuts in the departments, but the worst thing you can do is just across the board say everybody's going to be cut the same amount. You go figure it out, because departments have different bases for their funding. Not all of them are state general fund dependent, number one. And number two, when you cut across the board like that, you're ensuring mediocrity. You're saying to everybody, you're just going to get a little bit worse. We've tried to address it more specifically in saying, and we've proposed this in some of these cuts, we have to cut programs. If we're not going to have the money, we can't keep doing everything we're doing. But every one of these programs has a constituency. Every one of these programs has people who have benefited from the services that are being provided. If the legislature concludes those services are no longer warranted, fine. But tell us what they are and face those constituencies and tell them they're no longer going to get funding.
Jay, can you give us some specific examples of cuts, of jobs that have lost? How many fewer state workers? How many fewer cars? Can you get into some of the nuts and bolts?
Yeah, the number of state workers, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but it has gone down, and I'm looking to see if I can find it in front of me. I don't have it, but I can provide that to you, because the number of state workers has been reduced. And it was reduced in large times in the Jindal days because we privatized the hospitals. And so all the state employees who are working for charity hospitals are no longer state employees. That was a massive drop from almost 100,000 or so employees into the to the 60s or so. But
any other state employee cuts in any other departments?
Oh, yeah. Yes. People are not filling positions when people retire. There have been some jobs lost. I mean, the mission is not necessarily to put people out of work if they're providing a function that is absolutely needed, but there are any number of departments who have seen reductions in their workforce.
And any other specific cuts you can tell us about that? You can elaborate? The people that say Governor Edwards hadn't made any cuts. Has he?
Well, of course he has. We had a $2 billion shortfall when the governor came into office, $2 billion. We raised $1 billion a year or so ago, 27 months ago. We cut about $600 million out of the budget. And it's everything from when TOPS was not fully funded, which was not a good thing, to reductions in services in health care. And again, I'm looking for my list. There's a list we've prepared. It's going to be made public.
Can you send that to
cuts
me?
That have been made. Absolutely.
Okay.
And I'm not the one who's generated it. It's being generated out of the governor's office, but they have it. And a lot of folks are at Washington Mardi Gras this week.
You
so
bet.
I think it's going to be next week. I'm holding down the fort here, but it'll be next week. But we'll get it to you the first thing next week.
I think the point Aaron is making is that when cuts are suggested, or when the governor says the health care has to be cut, TOPS, higher education, etc., people look at it and say it's always stuff that the public feels, and not necessarily that this huge bureaucracy in Baton Rouge feels.
Well, it's just not accurate. I'm looking at where I am here. We've reduced state general fund in the Department of Health of $174.5 million, largely in the Medicaid vendor program. We cut the partner hospitals by $30.5 million. Reduced the per member per month payment to the Medicaid managed care organizations by $27 million. Cuts almost $18 million in mental health rehabilitation services. Some cuts for rural hospitals. $1 million cut in the pediatric daycare funding, $12 million in general funding for higher ed, but we were able to restore TOPS, as you know, and universities were not cut in this governor's first budget for the first time in almost a decade. We made higher education a priority. We didn't have the money to increase their funding, but unlike what had been happening for the past 8 years, we didn't cut them. And we didn't raise tuition to make up for it so that it would look like there was not a cut. We postponed opening a brand-new center for juveniles in Bunkie, a beautiful building that's been built that's going to provide some relief for some overcrowded facilities. We don't have the money to fund that. There have been reductions in contract cancellations and revisions. We've identified almost $24 million in savings on those consulting contracts. We continue to look at those savings. People don't want to give us credit for doing that, but This is part of good management. It's part of what we had to do because of the budget we inherited, not through the fault of this governor, but what he stepped into, what I would have stepped into if I would have won the race, or any of the other candidates for governor would have inherited this same mess. So it's really disingenuous to say that this is something that this governor has created. He just wants to come in and raise taxes. It's not the mission here. It's to keep up with what we had because of the temporary taxes that the legislature created that is now disappearing.
Jay Dardenne, Administration Commissioner. Hoping to do it again soon. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.